G7 and NATO nations are vowing to support Kyiv for as long as it takes in the wake of widespread Russian missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg calls Russia's latest moves a sign of weakness. He says that the alliance will press ahead with planned nuclear drills next week and increase military stockpiles to backfill weapons sent to Kyiv. SABC News correspondent Rosie Bichard brings us the latest from Brussels.
The G7 group of so-called advanced economies, which includes the United States, the UK, Canada, Japan and the European Union, has been holding crisis talks after Moscow substantially stepped up attacks on Ukraine. Now, G7 countries have coordinated on successive rounds of sanctions against the Kremlin since this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia says these latest strikes were in response to explosions at a bridge in Crimea, but Kyiv says the Kremlin is raining terror on peaceful Ukrainian cities. Now, here in Brussels, NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says these fresh Russian strikes are just a signal that Moscow is struggling.
Russia is actually losing on the battlefield. They are giving up territory because they don't have the capabilities to stop the Ukrainian forces making advances. So the way they're able to then respond is by indiscriminate attacks on Ukrainian cities, hitting civilians, critical infrastructure, and of course this causes suffering, damage on Ukraine, but in many ways it actually reflects the lack of alternatives for President Putin.
The NATO boss also confirmed that the alliance will conduct nuclear deterrent exercises next week. Now, Moscow will likely see this or call this inflammatory. Russia insists NATO is a security threat, something that this defensive alliance denies. Stoltenberg said that cancelling the nuclear drills, which happen annually and were already planned before the war in Ukraine erupted, well, that, he said, would send the wrong message just as Moscow ramps up its own nuclear rhetoric. Rosie Bichard, SABC News, Brussels.
Russia's Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov says that Moscow is open to talks with the West over the Ukraine war, but they have yet to receive any serious proposals to negotiate. Lavrov says that the Kremlin is willing to engage with the US or Turkey to end the conflict.
The Kremlin has nailed its colours to the mast, and it says it won't turn down a meeting between President Vladimir Putin and US President Joe Biden at a mid-November summit of the G20 in Indonesia, and will consider the proposal if it receives one. Russian Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov says Moscow will be willing to listen to any suggestions.
Well, we've said, and we have said it many times, that we never refuse meetings. And if there's an offer, then we will consider it.
The Russian top diplomat says the US has long been involved in the war in Ukraine.
It seems to me that the Americans have been participating de facto in this war for a long time. They are not weaponizing Zelensky and his regime. They are providing satellite intelligence, including not only dozens of military satellites, but hundreds of commercial satellites, which are now being used in service of military plans of support for the neo-Nazi regime.
Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has also inspected the full training of newly mobilized reservists at a training range in the country's Western Military District. Meanwhile, Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas has appealed to NATO countries to provide Kyiv with air defense.
We send a clear message to all the Ukrainians. We are supporting you every possible way, and what we have to do is definitely deliver air defense from the Allies' side so that the Ukrainians can protect their cities, their civilians, because Russia is definitely escalating to harm the civilians.
G7 leaders have once again put a united front and denounced Russia's large-scale attacks in Ukraine. New missile strikes in various cities have killed a number of people, and Ukrainians woke up to a wailing of air raid sirens for a second day.
Indeed, the European Union condemns in the strongest possible terms these heinous attacks on the civilians and civilian infrastructure. These attacks, they are barbaric and cowardly attacks, and they only show that Russia is opting for a tactics with aiming and indiscriminately bombing the civilians, this is something which is against international humanitarian law, and this indiscriminate targeting of civilians amounts to a war crime.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked the leaders of G7 group of nations to urgently supply Ukraine with air defense weapons after Russia rained down cruise missiles on cities across the country in a new escalation of the war. Kylie Kumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, for a little bit more on this, we're now joined by Russian journalist and international relations commentator Rustem Safronov. Thank you so much for joining us, and always good to talk to you, Rustem. So let's try and unpack this latest round in this escalation of attacks. Moscow says this was a response to terrorist attacks by Ukraine. What do you make of that? Because there was explosions on the bridge to Crimea. Is that what President Putin was referring to as a terror attack?
Absolutely. And to begin with the conflict in February, Russia was making very clear statement. Crimea is out of process of any sort of negotiations about the status, and it shouldn't be touched at all whatsoever. Crimea was unified with Russia absolutely peacefully, and it should be stayed the same way. And when Ukrainians kind of crossed the borders in that conflict and start to attack territory of the Kremlin, Russia was able to restrain itself. For example, when it was military targets, airplanes and so on. But Crimean Bridge, it's also meant for very civil purpose. And just a lot of people who are traveling to see the beauty of Crimea and so on. And some of the civilians got hurt and died during that terrorist attack. So that's why Russia decided to retaliate and hit few targets in Ukrainian territory, which has something to do with a civilian infrastructure like power plants and so on, that sort of places which would make daily existence of Ukrainian people is also not very nice. Let's put it this way.
President Putin says that any further attacks of this nature will not go unanswered and that the response will be more severe. If that's the case, how difficult might it be to start any kind of negotiations to end this conflict?
Unfortunately, I think the statement of Foreign Minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, about possibility of negotiations purely rhetorical, because right now the positions of both sides so far apart. Nobody wants to really negotiate, and every side trying to get most advantages in a battlefield. Although, in the same time, I'm finding ludicrous statements of the gentleman from Brussels who used to say Russians don't have anything to respond to Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think Russia put a lot of hopes, not just in weapons, but not also in mobilizing the reservists and waiting when all these people would be able to join Russian troops in the battlefield. Because previously Russia used to fight in territory of Ukraine with fairly small and compact expedition corps. You know, it's like 150, 170,000 against the huge Ukrainian army, which used 4 waves of mobilization and training in the West. From that perspective, things became a little bit of uneven, and Russia now trying to even it up. But I would say Russia probably would like to have some kind of a peaceful solution, but with recognition, at least Donbas area, Crimea, and probably 2 in other areas which recently was unified with Russia, So, and Ukrainians want everything come back to border lines of 1991, and this position is just too far away. We would see substantial progress in willingness of both sides to negotiate when one of the sides will be seriously weakened and feel like could not win on a battlefield. Only in this case we'll see are they ready to compromise. Right now I don't see anybody just really seriously willing to compromise. Yes, right. Russia doesn't really declare they won't denazify Kiev, and I don't think they planning to march till western border like Lvov and so on. But they would like to get certain concessions from Ukraine. That's how I'm seeing the situation.
What about NATO? Because at the beginning of this conflict, it was about Ukraine and its possibility of joining NATO. Then it was about the annexed territories. So what do you think really is the driving force between this conflict that if that was negotiated, everything else becomes secondary?
Well, initially, all that conflict between Russia and Ukraine was based on desire of new Ukrainian government to join Western Bloc, move towards the West, and militarily move towards the West. In the fourth day after coup d'etat in 2014, provisional Ukrainian government said we want to denounce agreement about Black Sea Fleet, which is in territory of Crimea. So that's all push. Mr. Putin made the decision about taking over Crimea as soon as possible to prevent American fleet being based in Sevastopol. So since that, NATO more and more getting involved in the training Ukrainian forces, arming them, and now providing for them very crucial, not just military, but logistical and intelligence support, which is making basically Russia fight against entire Western community, because Ukrainian troops getting training in territory of Poland and officers in territory of England and so on, and more sophisticated contemporary weapon just delivering in territory of Ukraine non-stop. So yes, it is right now global conflict, and more it's getting global, more it's dangerous for entire world.
So President Zelensky has asked the G7 for an air shield. NATO says that they'll support Kyiv with whatever it needs throughout this conflict. And as you said, it seems as if a number of countries are aligned in fighting Russia through Ukraine. Can Russia then, with all of this in its way, end this conflict militarily, or will they have to negotiate? Because it looks like a war that nobody can win.
Yes, finally, I think after a certain amount of spilled blood and exhaustion, sides would have to negotiate. But you have to understand, for West wants to punish Russia, whatever they could see, whatever aggressive regime in Kremlin and so on. We have to stop them, whatever, against annexation, independent territory. That's the rhetoric. But for Russia, it's a matter of existence. Russia could not allow itself to lose, because in this case, it could start process of disintegration of Russia, not just collapse power in the Kremlin, and whatever repetition of the same process what happened in 1991, continuation of destruction of empire. And for Russian people, whatever, people of Russia, it would be a huge tragedy, whatever, Russia will start to fall apart. So that's why Russia doesn't really have too much room to retreat from that conflict. Even initially, Russia maybe planned to get rid of Ukrainian regime fast enough into able to have somebody friendly in Kyiv who would be like Russia-oriented, more not pro-Western. It doesn't happen. But again, Russia doesn't have room and space to retreat, not geographically, but politically, because in this case, it will trigger very negative process inside Russian Federation itself.
Rustem, we'll leave it there. Great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Always pleasure to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. That's one of our regular commentators, Russian journalist and international relations commentator, Rustem Safronov, joining us there, giving us his thoughts on what looks like a conflict that is not going to be ended by continued war, but it looks at this stage that the journey towards a negotiating table looks pretty remote at this time.